Okay, we're back. It is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Williams from Watchmen, Derek Cianfrance from I Know This Much Is True, Nichelle Tramble Spellman from Truth Be Told, Ellen Paul from the Eddy, and Paul Sims from What We Do in the Shadows. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being part of this.
Thank you.
Hi.
And let's just start with a basic question for people who may have seen these clips but haven't seen more of the shows. Why don't we just go around and tell us a little bit more about your show and how you came to be involved with it, why you wanted to be part of it. Alan, you want to start since you're
Sure.
next to me here on the screen?
Okay, thanks, Steve. The Eddy was a project very close to my heart that took a really long time to gestate. It kind of developed in a very organic way, but kind of backwards from the way that shows usually are. Glenn Ballard, the great producer and composer, came to me in 2013 and said, here, I've written a suite of songs and I want to make a show about a jazz club in Paris. And the songs were amazing, but that was pretty much it. And so from there, I said, okay, jazz club in Paris. So I went to Damien Chazelle, who I knew from Whiplash was interested in jazz. I knew that he was half French and had grown up partly in Paris. And then Damien went off to make La La Land. So he brought in Jack Thorne to write the script. So it kind of went song, location, characters, and then story at the end. So as befits that, it's an 8-episode series about a jazz club in Paris and the band that plays there and the people in their lives. But it has a very loose and, as you could see in that scene, improvisational feel that is trying on every level to kind of not mimic, but to kind of resonate with the unusual extemporaneous energy of jazz.
Mm-hmm. Is that why you wanted to be part of it?
I wanted to be part of it because I fell in love with Glenn's songs and I love Paris. And just to be, I said it was worth trying to build something around these songs and this idea. And then, being there from the beginning is always the most fun.
Yeah. Okay. Stephen, tell us what brought you to, tell us a little bit about Watchmen and what brought you to it.
Watchmen is a reworking of one of the great graphic novels of the 20th century, also called Watchmen. And it had a previous incarnation as a feature film made by Zack Snyder. And then Damon Lindelof, whom I had worked with a lot before on a show called Lost that we did in the early 2000s. Had loved this comic book ever since he was a kid, and he had been introduced to it by his father, and it influenced and informed his own personal approach to storytelling for the screen, and influenced Lost a lot in terms of flashbacks and structure. And Damon, as I understand it, had been approached many times by various parties, HBO among them, to do a version of that story utilizing some of the characters and obviously the canon and the history of the piece. And it wasn't until fairly recently when he read an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates called The Case for Reparations that had been printed in The Atlantic that he figured out for himself a way that would be satisfying to rework that material and to interweave it with an examination, a dramatic exploration of the ways in which white supremacy and race are intertwined in American history, present culture. And, obviously because he and I had worked together before in the past, when he approached me with this idea and I read the material, it was powerful and relevant and rich in a multiplicity of ways, and so it was a no-brainer to kind of sign on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Derek, tell us a little more about I Know This Much Is True and why you wanted to do it.
Well, it goes back a number of years. I mean, Mark Ruffalo had always been one of my favorite actors. When I first saw You Can Count on Me, I don't know when that was, 2003, 2004. I was in maybe the 6th year of trying to make my film Blue Valentine. And when I saw that film, I said, okay, that's a perfect guy to play in Blue Valentine. So I sent him the script, and I just never heard anything back from him. Just complete and utter rejection from Mark Ruffalo's camp.
Oh, and you had to fall back on Ryan Gosling.
Yeah. So anyway, that was before I ever knew Ryan Gosling. I had never heard of Ryan Gosling before. So anyway, I eventually made the right film with Gosling and Michelle Williams. And then I was at Sundance, and Mark also had a film in Sundance in 2010, and we were like in the same director's class. And I basically told him that I didn't hold a grudge. I didn't hold it against him. I still loved him. And we just kind of formed an instant kind of bond. We just felt like brothers. And so we always thought we would try to find something to do together. And he had maybe 6 years ago got the rights to this Wally Lamb novel called I Know This Much Is True, which had, Wally had optioned this back in like 98 and tried to get it made into a feature film, but it's a 1,000-page novel, and it's just impossible to turn into a 2-hour film. And Wally's dream actor for it was Mark. And once Mark got the rights to it, Mark called me and asked if I was interested in working on it and making it. And, all the films I make are about families and about secrets held within families and kind of reckoning with personal legacy and kind of a view of the bond and the burden that comes with being a family member. And so it felt like something I was born to make. And that's how I came in touch with it.
Right. Nichelle, what made you want to do Truth Be Told, and tell us a little more about that story?
Well, Truth Be Told started out as a novel by Kathleen Barber called Are You Sleeping? And I did a general meeting at Chernin because I'd worked with one of the execs there before. And on the way out, she said, oh, here's a novel that you might want to take a look at. And that was Christmas 2017. Yeah, Christmas 2017. And I took it home and read it and liked the idea of sort of exploring crime from the point of view of victims and what the ripple effect is in families when there's a tragedy that sort of lasts for generations. And I was also interested in the idea that we've become so addicted to, true crime stories, and very few of them spend time with the victim's family, and they seem to be almost an afterthought. So I thought if we lived in that space, that would be interesting, and then live with the reporter who's basically opening up an old wound in these people's lives and what that does. So that was the idea that we started playing with, and Octavia came on board pretty early. She's a huge true crime fan. And so we sort of bonded over the fact that her and her sisters watch Snap marathons at Christmas, and so do mine. And then that just sort of broke the ice between us, and we kept going from there. And that's what we all set out to do, just to not do a straight whodunit, but look at all the families involved in these tragic cases.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Paul, how did What We Do in the Shadows go from a one-off movie to a TV series, and why did you want to be involved?
Well, first of all, did anybody who watching those clips at the beginning get the sense that I don't belong here? Because you guys are doing such powerful, elegant shows, and ours ended on a fart joke, our clip package.
It was a really good fart joke.
It was a good one, but still, I feel like I should be sitting at the children's table in this. Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi made really just scrabbled together and made their own original movie, which was for anyone who hasn't seen it, is a fake documentary about vampires living in the real world. And I had worked with Jermaine and Taika both on Flight of the Conchords 10 years ago. And when Jermaine said that they wanted to make a TV show version, I was interested. And I guess as far as wanting to be involved, it's been a while since I worked on something that was just pure silliness, which was to me the appeal. I mean, I worked on Girls for a few years, and I helped get Atlanta started. and I love those shows, but it's been a while since I worked on something that has zero redeeming value beyond fart jokes like the one you saw and other silliness.
Right. I think in these times, silliness is a redeeming value.
I hope so.
Right. Well, let me go back to Derek and Nichelle, because you're both working from a novel, and I know in both cases, you changed some things about the novel, you kept some stuff, you didn't keep other stuff. How do you judge, what belongs and when you should move away from the source material when you're working from a book?
Well, with Are You Sleeping, the podcaster who's at the center of the show was a minor character in the book. And it was told from the point of view of the twins who are played by Lizzie Kaplan on the show. But that would mean that it was very closed-ended if we just followed that. And then once we had Octavia on board, of course, that was the lead character come to life, but we also had to change her race. So then what happened there is that we created the backstory and built a family around her with Ron Cephas Jones, Michael Beach, and Tracy Toms. So we basically had the spine of the novel, the basic story that we wanted to tell with the mystery, and then it sort of bloomed from there based on casting, based on the fact that we wanted to have a little more longevity.
Mm-hmm. All right. Derek, for you?
Yeah. Well, it all starts really with Wally Lamb, who wrote, this amazing book that I was a fan of, that was on my mother's shelf for 20 years. I always saw it back there. I was always intimidated by the sheer size of the novel. When Mark gave it to me, it took me a long, long time to read it because I'm very, very slow as a reader. But then I had a meeting with Wally, and Wally gave me the trust, I guess, and the creative license to make it my own. And if he hadn't have done that, I don't know what place I would have had in the process necessarily, because, it was going to be a 6-part series. I ended up writing 371 pages adapted from this novel that was a 900-page novel. Adapting something from literature to the screen, it isn't a 1-to-1 ratio. They're two different, they're different mediums, they're different languages. So there's part of it which is a curation process, part of it is a subtraction process, but then it's also what Wally gave me was the ability to kind of project my own fears and fantasies and psyche into the piece, and it really became one of the most personal films that I've ever made, and it was based on someone else's work. But I also understood it on such a deep level because I come from an Italian American family. I'd only seen like gangster movies for Italian Americans, but that didn't represent how I grew up as a kid. That didn't represent kind of this masculine identity that was kind of foisted upon me as my whole life. And so I really wanted to just confront that and deal with it. And Mark had the same thing. And so it just became, honestly, just like effortless to do it. It just felt like I knew it so well. And like I said, Wally allowed me the privilege and the space to create. And, it's different than the novel, but it's inspired by it. So to me, it's the same story, same heart,
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, for Stephen and Paul, I feel like you don't have source material in the sense that there is a story laid down, but you have a world that was created in another work that you're now working in. So, it's like Stephen, for Watchmen, how influenced are you by the visuals, the style of the original graphic novel?
We were very influenced. We thought of the original graphic novel as canon, we referred to it internally as the Old Testament, and what we were doing was roughly akin to the New Testament. So it was a very solid foundation narratively and visually, but obviously we then kind of took it in completely new unfamiliar territory, I think. And we ultimately used the platform of the graphic novel as a springboard to jump into, in some cases, extending our awareness and our understanding of characters that had existed within the context of the graphic novel, and in other cases to evolve them, change them, bend them, twist them to our own design. But it was certainly great too. We were very aware of, resting on the shoulders of the legacy of such an esteemed and highly regarded literary property. But ultimately, I think that we were not hamstrung by it. It was wind at our backs.
Mm-hmm. Right. Paul, for you, I mean, did you feel wedded to the style of the original film?
The style of the original film was so worked so well, adhering strictly to documentary rules, not having close-ups where you would ordinarily want a close-up, really saying we're only capturing what a documentary crew could capture. And just even though our entire cast for the television version is all new people and different vampires living in Staten Island instead of New Zealand, just the general tone and the vibe were very well established. But I also want to talk for a second about Steven's episode of Watchmen, which after I watched it, I went back and looked up who directed it, and IMDb'd him immediately because it was the best thing I've seen on television in 5 or 10 years, directorially, and especially the way the transitions and how it moved from scene to scene really captured the spirit of the graphic novel in a way that most attempts to do comic book things don't do. So no offense to anyone else, but I did want to say something nice about that because I loved it. I was really blown away by it.
That's very kind of you, Paul. And yes, if you are wondering, Paul is in fact on my payroll. And, clearly worth every penny.
Well, I do want to get back to that episode, Stephen. But first, I want to ask Alan, because you're not dealing with something that already existed. You're taking your inspiration from jazz music and from a setting. You mentioned that you wanted the show to have the feel of jazz, but how did that translate as you were trying to figure out what this would look like, what it would feel like?
Well, it was so exciting to build this world essentially from scratch with a dozen songs at our back. And one of the things we knew going in was that we wanted to show Paris as it is now. You say you're going to do a show set in a jazz club in Paris, and everybody says, "Ooh, 40s, ooh, 60s." I never had anybody think that the show was contemporary when I told them what the show was about. But what we wanted to do was show Paris today, that is the multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, multi-faith Paris, which is really what Paris is. It's not those 5 or 6 little arrondissements in the center of the city that the tourists go to. So we really wanted to explore a Paris that we, as 3 Americans and a Brit, didn't really know that well. And there was a lot of research done in building the world. And Jack created the character of Elliot that Andre Holland plays as this incredibly conflicted person who could then be the wellspring of the tension that pervades the show. Someone who's a brilliant musician who's undergone severe trauma a few years back and has become a very disagreeable person and is trying to find his way back to humanity. And based on that, we set the show around the fringes of Paris, mostly in the Northeast. I don't know if you know Paris, the 18th and 19th and 20th arrondissement, and the banlieue, the suburbs, which are not like American suburbs, the suburbs outside of the highway that encircles Paris, which is where the projects are. And we made all of the French characters, all the main French characters, be of North African descent or sub-Saharan African descent. And this was, so the challenge was building a world that we had to keep authentic, even though we weren't French. And we relied very heavily, obviously, on our French partners. But it was enormously rewarding because when we thought we were showing a Paris that hadn't been seen by American audiences or UK audiences, but in making the show, our fantastic French crew would frequently come up to us and say, this is a Paris that we've never seen on French television. The networks don't go here. And so that's when I knew we had made something that was really original. And that was probably the most rewarding feedback that we got.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk about the particular challenges of each of these shows. And it occurs to me that another thing that Nichelle and Derek have in common is that your show features an actor who's playing twins that are often in the same scene together. And so I wonder for the two of you, how does that complicate both the planning and the shooting of those scenes?
Oh, I think that the director who came in for episode 4, Mikael Norgard, ended up being our producing director, and he had the hardest episode. He had the twins, and he had them underwater in a pool. And so the first day he showed up, I was just like, welcome, and I'm sorry. It was always everybody prepared for twin days. It just took a little bit more time. But the thing that was great about it is that Lizzie Kaplan is such a pro. And, I was so grateful for the 3, leads that I had, because they were always prepared. And that took so much pressure off the pressure of shooting. We didn't have to stop for, someone to learn the lines or do anything else. And she was learning 2 characters, and she really made them different. The first day that she was in the blonde wig for one of the twins, I walked right past her. And so it was just kind of fun to watch that. And previous to this, I'd been on shows that were room heavy with not a lot of set, experience. So for me, it was just wonderful to watch it. And I think that probably by episode 8, everyone was just massively exhausted.
All right. Derek?
Yeah. For, one of the very first conversation I had with Mark, I thought to myself, okay, how do we do twins without it being a technical trick? Because I didn't want the technical side of it to get in the way of what we were doing. And I started to think, okay, when these 2 guys were born, they were identical. They looked exactly the same. But when we meet them, they're 40-something years old. And so they have 40 years of life experience, of choices, of consequence. One of the twins is schizophrenic, so he's on some medication. And I know people that have been on medication that have gained weight. And so I told Mark that if I was going to do it, we would have to enable this process where we wouldn't shoot the same twins on the same day. In fact, we ended up shooting 16 weeks of Mark as one twin, and then he went away for 6 weeks. He gained 30 pounds, and then we came back to the same location. Sometimes, the big challenge was to shoot a driving scene, for instance, in a car, where one side was shot in April and the other side was shot in September. And to have that continuity between the 2 characters. And still, I one of the things I'm most interested in as a filmmaker is behavior of people, not just a performance, but finding behavior. And one of the things that happened when Mark put on this weight gain is that he completely embodied a completely different person, and it changed who he was on a molecular level, really. And I had to cast my good friend Gabe Fazio to play opposite Mark in all those scenes, so he would have someone that he could actually improvise with. And it was a technical challenge, but when people saw it, I didn't want them ever to think that there was any strain or any challenge to doing it. I just wanted them to get lost in those 2 characters and those 2 people. And the only thing I will say is when Mark Ruffalo's dad first saw the trailer to our show, he asked Mark, he said, "Looks great. Who'd you get to play your brother?" So I took that as a compliment.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, let's go back to you and back to episode 6, which is the one that was mentioned before. I mean, it starts with a TV show that you've recreated. It has a lot of flashback sequences in black and white. It has a fight scene that's set just to percussion. It jumps back and forth a lot as it's telling the story. I mean, it strikes me that must have been, as a director, an extremely challenging episode to put together.
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with the script. Damon Lindelof and Cord Jefferson wrote an amazing episode that was essentially the origin story of a character called Hooded Justice, and there were for sure certain technical aspects to the piece that required a lot of pre-planning and forethought. But fortunately, just the way in which we work together, again, I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Damon and I have worked with each other before, so there's a certain kind of understanding and trust level. So the construction of the script, along with, that Damon and Cord put together, was informed in many ways by discussions and conversations that we had together about what the specific visual vocabulary of that episode was going to be like. And it was the right kind of challenge, insofar as we were at every turn exhilarated by the prospect of telling this particular story in the specific way in which we did, but equally terrified that it would be complete and utter disaster. And we rode the margin between those two emotions throughout the entire making of that piece. And in many ways, that's a kind of, energizing place to be. I'm sure all the other members of the panel are very familiar with that space of terror and self-doubt. And sometimes it can be a burden, but sometimes it's the right kind of impetus that you need to stretch into something that feels true and honest. And that's how, that was the approach. I could bore you with technical aspects of the endeavor, but you would have to specifically invite me to do that, because I'm desperately trying not to be burdensome to both the panel and the viewers.
Okay. Well, Alan, you directed the last 2 episodes of the Eddy, and the final episode, you pulled off this remarkable trick of having a very satisfying final episode that leaves almost everything hanging. Doesn't wrap up any plot lines, really, but it feels like it's a satisfying conclusion. I mean, was that a tricky thing to pull off?
Well, thank you, Steve. That's you made my day. But yeah, we wanted it to feel like a close, but this is not a show that asks for resolution. It's a show about people who are essentially leading very difficult lives and finding solace and joy in the music that they are creating together. So any kind of really, tying things up wouldn't work. And also, we'd love to have a second season. So it's that trick, which I think a lot of people here have experienced, where you have to do a season ender that may or may not be a series ender, and you're going to try and hit both points. But in this case, I think that what we wanted, the one thing that we wanted the only thing that could really resolve was Elliot's relationship with Julie. That's Andre Holland's character and Amanda Stenberg's character, who you saw in the clip, because they start off their father and daughter, they start off very, very much at odds. And really, the main love story of the entire season is their learning how to understand and respect each other and cede each other the space that allows for growth, and then come back together. And that we wanted everybody's heart to be full with that, and otherwise just to be able to feel the celebration of the band together. And so, I mean, it was really Jack Thorne's genius idea, which was that for the last scene, that there's a lot crime, bomb, there's a lot of plot stuff that happens, but the club in which they've been playing all season is suddenly shut down and taken away from them, and they feel that they have to play, and so they just go out into the streets of Paris and begin playing, and the final number is them playing out in the streets. And I feel like it does accomplish the sense of it. You haven't seen them outdoors, you haven't seen them really in a Paris that looks like Paris, and now they're suddenly playing outside of cafes. So I think it's something new, and something that brings a new level of joy and of, you know, their all embracing vision of the world into that one corner in Paris. But it was a logistical nightmare, and I don't want to bore you with all the details, but, you know, one of the principles of the show, one of the pieces of bedrock, was that all the music was recorded live. We never did playback.
Wow.
And it's partly because we wanted it to be authentic, and we had Glenn Ballard there, and he wrote all the songs. And the second thing is the shooting style that we developed, that really was more Damien's development, but was to do something that was kind of an amalgam of French New Wave and John Cassavetes. And so we were improvising a lot and just following the characters around. So it was always handheld and very loose. Every take was different. And in a situation like that, you can't be doing playback, because they have to be playing live every time, because you never know exactly what you're going to capture, but whatever you capture, that's what's in the frame. So we had settled this up for ourselves, and then suddenly they were doing a 100-yard long serenade in a crowded street in Paris that we were trying to record live. And they didn't have all their instruments, so they were like shaking cans and banging on pots and things. And so it was a brilliant idea Jack had. It nearly gave me a heart attack in executing it. But if you say it's a satisfying end to the season, that makes me very happy, and I hope there will be more.
Right. Yeah. So, Paul, I know that you've said that the goal of season 2 was to just make more funny episodes. But, I mean, were there particular challenges in coming back to that world and doing it again?
No, we did paint ourselves into a corner at the end of the first season by making the vampires familiar. Guillermo, who's their little assistant, who they treat terribly, discover that he's actually has vampire killer blood and in his heritage. So we had no idea what we were going to do we ended season 1 on that and didn't know what we were going to do with season 2. But then we ended up, I think, by painting ourselves into a corner, forcing ourselves to come up with a very interesting story about how he's torn between the vampires he loves, even though they treat him terribly, and the fact that he's a natural born vampire killer. Yeah. And then the other challenge was what two people have already covered. We did an episode where each of the vampires acted opposite themselves as their own ghosts. So we did actors playing 2 parts, but 4 times within one episode. And when I watch the samples from the other shows, I know what a nightmare it is, but fun.
Yeah. Well, I think I hear we've got lots of good audience questions, so maybe it's time for somebody else to start asking questions. So here's from Muggs Cahill. As a showrunner, do you feel like you have to give up some of your writing for the producer side, or is it simply a matter of being better at balancing 2 jobs?
I feel like all of us here are writers / produce. I mean, isn't it all part of the same thing at a certain point? I don't know. Someone else should answer better, probably.
I think there's at some point where you have to give up part of the process of writing. So I let my writers take it as far as they can through the network notes, the producer's notes, and everything else. And then for the final polish, maybe come in there. Because if I did every single step, then I would, end up in the ER. So there's a way to just kind of like figure out what part of the process that you could share with others and then keep both hats on. I think the biggest thing about being a first-time showrunner this year, besides not realizing there were so many questions in the world, was the idea of trying to figure out what to give away, what to keep, how much I could do, and then acknowledging that I could not do everything. So yes, there is a part of the writing side that I did have to put aside, but I had really great writers both seasons, and that was helpful.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. How did you each decide what streamer to pitch the project to? Did you target a single streamer or network, I guess, or go out to them all? If you went to them all, did you organize this through an agency? Practical advice.
Yeah,
Well,
you go to all of them, don't
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I mean, in my experience, we got rejected by all of them, except for HBO. So I mean, there's one. Yeah, when you're making a film or a series or whatever you believe in, part of the job is you have to believe in it so much, right? You have to will it into life because it's not going to exist unless you believe in it. And every person that surrounds you, they start to orbit that belief, and they believe in something that's greater than all of us. And to me, that's just the process of making something, especially this collaborative process that is filmmaking. You start as an entity, an idea forms, and then it's just more and more people, gravitate to it. And that could take 20 years to get people to gravitate to something. It could take, there's an indeterminate amount of time. And rejection is just part of the game.
Truly. We went out for 2 weeks, and we pitched to most of the streamers and networks. And we had our wish list and our top choices, but we gave it all at every single place that we were at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Was somebody else about to?
No, I was just going to say ours was different in that Scott Rudin saw Jermaine and Taika's movie and said this should be a TV show, and Jermaine and Taika said, I don't know, do we really want to do a TV show? And so they had to be dragged to do it. But then FX was very excited about it, and slowly they built some sort of enthusiasm for it.
All right. So here's another. Many showrunners say that being a showrunner is a job you learn to do as you go. What would be your biggest lessons as you learned how to be the showrunners you are today?
It's true. It's learning as you go. Even with all the experience that you could have in TV, there's just, it is very different to, be in a writer's room, focus on the writing, focus on pitching, focus on research, and then go to set where you're hiring entire departments, talking with the new directors that are coming in, overseeing the cast, and it all stops with you. So you can be prepared, but you very much learn as you go because there's something new every day. There's a new situation, and it's completely different from sitting in a writer's room debating snacks and lunch to being on set and watching all the different things that are going on and trying to keep control of it all.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have specific lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Nichelle says, and I would say one of my, seminal experiences was 6 Feet Under, and on that show, we paid a lot of attention to making sure the writers could carry their weight as producers, and we insisted that the writers always be on set for their episodes and that they be studying breakdowns and learning the craft of being a producer. And not just be, no, I think he should read the line a different way. Not that that's what people do, Nichelle, but you know what I mean, reductively. And I think it is something that the most important thing is being open to learning the production side of the trade. And, in 6 Feet Under, I think that every one of the writers who was in that room has gone on to become a showrunner. So I feel like we were at least starting them in the right direction.
It's good. That's fallen away, but that used to be the standard where you produced your episode and and then there's someone there who knows the piece of the story that hasn't been, the actors are not aware of yet, whatever else is going on. But that's fallen away a little bit with shorter orders, smaller rooms and everything else. But on Truth Be Told, all our writers go to set. They sit in on the production meeting, the tone meeting, casting, so that they know all of these things. And then it was great. We had people come in and I felt comfortable enough to be honest about what I didn't know. So, and there were great people. There are people that would take advantage of that, but we had really great people season 1 and now season 2. And I would just straight up say, walk me through that. Tell me what that is. And then you won't have to do it a second time, but educate me here. And so there are things that, if I didn't admit that, I think there would be a lot more mistakes, but just being honest about what I didn't know and trusting the people that I hired to actually collaborate.
I've always done the same thing as far as making sure the writers are on set, especially for their episodes, or as much as possible, because it benefits you in 2 ways. One of which is the next season, they're able to take more of the load and make more of the decisions and start producing. And it also, I think, makes them better as writers because they see all the 75% of other bullshit that's involved that goes into it, and it's not as easy as sitting in the room and going, well, why can't we have this scene with 150 people? It'd be funnier, you know. I think it helps their writing, and the training also helps them as future producers.
Okay, from Rachel, for Stephen specifically and everyone in general, talk about your visual approach to the material in terms of storytelling, and for Stephen specifically, the hallucinatory storyline.
For me, the kind of approach to telling a story always starts with character, always starts with trying to figure out how best to connect the audience with the character's journey through the narrative, how to remove as much as possible the distance between the experiences that the character is having and the viewer. So that, of course, is different in every, for every story that you're telling and every character and every piece that you're approaching. As it pertains to this episode that I think you're referring to when you're asking about the hallucinatory storyline, I should also say that we were very, very fortunate in that we were working with HBO, who gave us the time and the resources necessary to build an approach to telling this story in the way that it currently appears. And by that, I mean, we had enough time in prep I took the stand-ins and a very, very small crew to all the locations, and we shot the episode. And then I edited the episode, looked at it, made some adjustments, backfilled those adjustments to Damon and Cord, who in turn adjusted the script. I went back and I did the same thing again. The stand-ins knew the script inside and out, and they were amazing. And I shot it a second time until I was happy with some of the technical specifics of the particular visual grammar that we were deploying to tell this story, most relevantly as it pertains to the transitions through scenes and between characters, so that by the time we brought the cast and the main crew to each of the scenes, we had a really, really clear visual template of how we were going to approach that. There was still room on the day for everybody for things to be discovered and new choices to be made. But for the most part, we were anchored by having that template, and it turned out to be an amazing way to approach this particular episode. And as you asked, the hallucinatory storyline, the crew and the cast were so thoroughly invested in doing justice and honor to this particular story. So that's how we approached it.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to add anything about visual approach?
I could just say that the way we shot the Eddy is kind of the opposite of the visual approach I've taken in my other work. It was because we wanted to have this sense of the extemporaneous and the idea that mistakes might be made and you would see them or things could go wrong. We just sort of decided early on that we were going to follow the actors around and that we weren't going to worry about continuity, and we weren't going to worry about editing, and we weren't going to worry about which side of the line we were on. And we kind of threw out the rule book that way. And that was scary because there are certain principles of film grammar that you kind of take as gospel when you're a director. And it ended up being a very freeing experience, and it ended up benefiting the end product enormously. And when we had mistakes in a scene, like something wouldn't cut the way something should be cut in an orthodox manner, we just found another way. It's not right for every material, but because of the storytelling of this particular series, it was the right way to go.
We had a visual style for each storyline. So there were 3 different looks going on in the show. For Aaron Paul's character, who's in prison, it's very blue and stark and a little icier. For Octavia's character, when she's in Marin, in this very fancy world that she lives in. It's very bright and upbeat. And then when she's in Oakland with her family, it has a very juke joint kind of bluesy look to it. And we had a score and a soundtrack that matched each one of those visual looks. So we set out to do that from the beginning, just so you could see these three fractured families.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For Paul, Taika Waititi is one of my favorites. How much creative freedom do you give him for this show? Is there a lot of improv?
Taika directed, I think, 2 episodes in the first season, and he and Jermaine both have the same sort of directorial style, which they, I think, perfected by doing the movie, which is a lot of improv from the actors, and as long as we hit the main story points we want to hit, we hit them. But there's a ton of improv, and by the time it comes to the editing room, I can't remember what we wrote and what they came up with, which is also a credit to the actors for knowing their characters so well. It's also much easier to incorporate improv on a show like this, which has such a strict documentary style, because we can just jump cut, we can trim things out. If you would, it makes it feel even more like a documentary. The fact that we're jumping around, all the things that Alan was doing on his show, we try to make it look like we're actually there, just following some vampires around and letting what happens happen. And sometimes you have to work hard to make it look like, if there's a building exploding behind you, you have to make it look like, oh, the cameraman didn't know that was going to happen and they're just going to capture it. But our special effects and our stunts are very heavily rehearsed and planned and scripted, but within that, there's a ton of improvisation from all the actors.
Right. Okay. For Derek, could you find it tough to adapt the book into this show?
Yes. Yes. But geez, it's like, maybe we all agree on this. For me, shooting the show, making the show is like being on vacation. Like, working is vacation. It's the time between working that's hard. Like, the time trying to get something going. That's the struggle as a filmmaker. It's like when you're actually making something, that's what you're living for, is those moments, at least for me, to be on set, to be working with actors, and to be writing something, and then eventually to be in the editing room. One thing I'll say about, for me, 6 years, so I was writing this thing before I was able to get on set, right? 5-6 years. Every day that I'm not shooting, I'm thinking about it. I'm stuck in my head. It's like imagining the screen of what I'm going to be seeing. Visualization, right? And so for me, when I get on set, the last thing I want to do is see what I've been seeing in my head for these I'm so bored with what I've been seeing in my head. Now I have a crew, now I have actors, now I have other artists around me that can show me something new and surprise me. And so to me, that's the thrill of being alive. That's what, and as filmmakers, like, how much time of our lives do we actually spend on set? It's not that much. I know this much is true. We shot 116 days. We didn't really board it out like a show. I just shot it basically like, to me, it was a long form movie. But it's 116 days over the course of 6 years. It's a very rare experience. So it's precious, And so, I don't know, on day one, when I talked to the crew, I told them a speech. My mom had told me when she was raising me, she said that sometimes on a Saturday morning, she would think about all the stuff she had to do that day. And she would just think about getting to the end of the day. And she said now that she's in her 70s, she just wishes she could go back and enjoy one of those days and not look forward to getting it over with. And so I told the crew on day one, I was like, we're not going to count down. We have 116 days to shoot this. Let's not say 115 days left or 99 days left. Let's say day one and treat every day like a birthday. And every day is a celebration. We're here together. We're making something. We'll never be back here again. And now I'm a year removed. We're all in lockdown. Sometimes I just look at my phone and just go to the Photos app and see where I was a year ago today. And it was like the greatest time of my life. So tough, relentless, I would say, is relentless and a joy would be the way I would describe it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For Alan, what was the hardest part about directing a musical drama?
As I kind of alluded to, the fact that all the music was live meant that we had to be basically it was if we were putting on a live show, we were recording that live show to make a record quality album, and we were filming it at the same time. So it was happening in the space, it was happening in the recording studio that was built into the space, and of course it was happening on camera. So there were just for a show where we were trying to be spontaneous and handheld and let anything happen, there were an awful lot of wheels spinning. What we did to make it work is the show was all shot on practical locations in Paris, in a lot of small rooms and out on the streets and in the projects. But for the jazz club, we took an old abandoned movie studio and we built the jazz club as a set inside the walls. It's our one set. And by doing that, we were able to actually build a recording studio so that it looks very much like a jazz club, but there are miles and miles of cables that are leading back to a command center off stage where we had a team of engineers working, so that when we were recording live, we had to make sure that it was professional quality recording. At the same time that the players would stop and start, the actors would interrupt them, they would do a scene. So usually when you do a musical, you're shooting the playback. You pre-record the songs in advance, and a lot of the time the band and the vocalist are miming to make sure that it comes out perfect and that the sound is perfect. And we didn't afford ourselves that luxury. So the toughest thing was making it all work live and yet making it sound good on everybody's home theater or iPhone, whichever they were listening on.
How did you keep the tempo steady between different takes? Or
Randy Kerber, who's the pianist in the band and who was actually the pianist in the original band that Glenn put together 7 years ago, and was our musical director. As the pianist, he had a click track because it was always, he set the tempo. He would count them down, he would set the tempo, and he had the click, but only he had it. And it was such a great band that they were always able to keep it within a millisecond.
Wow.
Okay. So we've got a question for Nichelle. Love the show. I've read that the series was inspired by the career of Sarah Koenig. Did you speak to Sarah directly for research, or how did you prepare for this?
Well, thank you, Zoe. The show was based on a novel that had a podcast at its center. And so it wasn't necessarily based on Sarah directly, but Sarah was a consultant for the show. And she was great. She was very helpful. I think she was horrified by what we did with journalism, but that was the point. I really wanted to have a reporter who gets so involved in the story, and she breaks the first rule of journalism by making it personal. And then she just goes down this road that's kind of buck wild, for lack of a better word. So I think that there were points where Sarah probably buried her head in the sand, but she was great. She was a consultant from the very beginning for us.
Okay, well, I think this is the last question, and it's for Stephen. What made you decide to use the Tulsa Massacre as the storyline for the whole series?
I can't honestly take credit for that decision. That decision was made by Damon Lindelof, as he was reading, I think in 2017, he was reading an essay called The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates that was published first in The Atlantic and then later collected in a series of essays in another book. And he encountered the Tulsa Massacre for the first time. In his recollection, this massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 resulted in the destruction of what was then known as the Black Wall Street, a thriving Black community in Tulsa. And it occurred to him that if he was going to nestle that event at the core of a reiteration of Watchmen, and that was set in the near future or near present, that in much the same way that the destruction of the planet Krypton was the kind of birth moment for Clark Kent / Superman, so too this event could become the catalyst to set all the pieces of the narrative puzzle that became our iteration of Watchmen into play. And just from a purely story level, obviously there are huge issues attached to that event in American history, and the reverberations are still being felt to this day. But the trauma that event occasioned for a character at the center of our piece called Will Reeves, that was the real kind of kernel at the heart of the story that Damon chose, that turns out to be that worked obviously within the context of our story, and has as people have continued to excavate that portion of American history that has been buried and left in the shadows for many people, as that event has come to life along with many others in recent times, in recent days and years, it's acquired particular resonance and refracted off the construction of Watchmen, our series, in a way that we certainly hadn't imagined, but that are satisfied is now finally being seen for what it is, and being examined and explored, and all the ramifications that came from that event.
Right. Well, I think we need to wrap up with that, but thanks to everybody on the panel for joining us. Thanks for everybody in the audience who's looking. If you want to go to more of these, check out the free trial TheWrap Pro. We'll tell you about these before anybody else. And panelists, thank you all so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Good luck for everyone.